This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. The Earth Transformed, a new book, an extensive tour through Homo sapiens and before, mankind and the ecology of the Earth. We are in the 21st century, so this is a commonplace topic now, climate change. However, I welcome Professor Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History at Worcester College, Oxford, whose new book is The Earth Transformed, an Untold History. We'll begin in the Holocene with two violent events to show that mankind responds to nature, responds to catastrophe, responds to climate change, and gets lucky sometimes. Professor, a very good evening to you. Congratulations. We begin with the breakdown of the ice dam in the Laurentide part of North America, which changed the ocean circulation and affected climate globally. And then also within the same time frame, 7th, 8th century, 7th millennium before the Common Era, the collapse of a piece of the Norwegian coast that created a tsunami. Those two events, what do they describe? How do they change the nature of mankind at that point responding to nature? Good evening to you.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me come and join you, John. And thank you all for listening and watching. Well, I guess the starting point is that we've got so used in the modern era to being masters of our own destiny that we forget about these great forces in the human past and how important they are in our history. And that includes things like volcanic eruptions, of course, going back a long time before humans, asteroid impacts or meteor impacts that got rid of the dinosaurs, amongst other things. But sometimes single one-off events can come from dislocations of global climate patterns that can produce cascade effects. It's a phrase that is much spoken about today by scientists, warning about, for example, points of no return, where you enter a violent circle, a vicious circle, where heating generates more warm waters that melt ice even quicker. And these two events that you mentioned, one is the Laurentide ice sheet that is a dam that holds together part of an ice dam over the Hudson Bay. And that suddenly produced very, very heavy levels of flooding and accelerates a whole series of circulation patterns that makes the Northern Hemisphere become about 1 to 3 degrees warmer and sea level rises of about 1 meter. This is taking place at the time of the transition out of the Ice Age, where the movement of the sea levels globally is such that about 1/3 of the continent of what's now Australia was underwater. And through new scientific techniques using LIDAR and thermal imaging, we can see human habitations that are 160 miles off the coast of what's now Australia as a result. So these big events have shaped the ecologies, they've shaped the landscapes, and they've opened up opportunities for some of our ancestors, but they've closed them off for others. So in the case of the Laurentide ice sheet, for example, the dramatic changes to the geology of Northern America and the Northern Hemisphere produced a burst of the signal and the pulse of humans settling in North America, making it easier. In the case of the landslide of Norway, well, what that did had in some ways dramatic effects that are visible today, which is it cut off what's now Great Britain from the rest of Europe, where they were connected by land. The flooding was so extensive that it went many kilometers inland. And the long-term effect that had on the politics, let's say, of Europe was that by the time of the 17th and 18th century, a time of European competition, the British didn't have to keep such a large land army as its European rivals, because to protect the borders of France or Austria, you needed several 100,000 men. And the British invested their money in small numbers of elite troops, and above all in a navy to protect and patrol their coast. And that then led to, I think you could argue, the rise of the idea that Britain was exceptional. It was different in some ways to its European neighbors, but also similar when it wanted to be. And even things like Brexit maybe wouldn't have happened if we'd all been part of the same landmass and had similar kinds of experiences. But geology, geography, and these events, climatological and otherwise, have a great deal, I think, to make us think differently about the past.
I seize on these two events because they're, well, dramatic, but at the same time, they're happening inside the Holocene period, where you emphasize it's possible that photosynthesis has become more effective, that there are more calories available, especially for farmers. And this is a transformation from the so-called hunter-gatherer to farming community. But you've taught me that it's not so neat. That was always too much clear this side or that side. It has been going on for some years, and farming has been spreading from, I guess, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, all the way to Europe. At the event of this collapse of the Norwegian coast and the flooding of what is now the English Channel, was there farming going on in what is now France and Britain? Were they already agricultural?
A lot depends on what these terms mean, and in the absence of written evidence, who chooses to apply them. So we think of farming as something that is, a homestead where there's a small family, perhaps, that is deliberately cultivating a set number of fields for their own benefits and perhaps surplus that they can do something with. But in other ways, the domestication of crops and even the domestication of animals, it's quite a gray area. I mean, in fact, even today, those distinctions about what is a hunter-gatherer, who is sedentary, who is nomadic, I think are very blurred. And I think it just speaks to our idea that we want to see kind of breakthrough moments. We want to be able to date when farming began and then assume that once it had begun, knowledge was passed on like in a classroom from one community to the other, and people just got better and better at stuff, because that's what the modern era makes us think. But the haphazard experimentation, the failures, the ways in which crops didn't feed you, the ways in which people ate things that killed them, those things don't survive. So I think the interesting thing, I think, for me is why do we want to make a distinction about when the first towns or cities or urban settlements begin, and how do we try to explain those? But clearly, like you say, John, the key is calorie availability, because if you're able to feed yourself with less labor output, or labor input rather, then your output can be spent on other things. And if you can find a good niche that allows you plentiful ability to cultivate or to be able to harvest what grows naturally, then your ability to create hierarchies and to have people who are stronger or better access to water or better access to or better soils, then starts to create the kinds of competition for space and therefore social competitions that lead to all sorts of different kinds of social patterns. And often the discussion has been with archaeologists and anthropologists has been around cities doing something different, but you find hierarchies in different ways in mobile groups and in indigenous peoples. So there are just different ways in which things get solved, but it's how you can exploit the environment and the natural resources to one's own benefit is the key.
One of the joys of your book, Professor, is that you do not just keep us into Northern Europe, where we've read all the stories and enjoyed all the plays. You traveled to the American bottom, that's the Mississippi, you traveled to China, especially northern China, traveled to the Nile Valley. You traveled to Niger, where they had ostrich egg shells for carrying water, for ceramics at this time. The cultures are all responding to global changes in climate. And Northern Europe responded to that tsunami. And so the North Atlantic circulation, does that mirror other things that are going on in the Pacific at the time? Do we have a record of that, Professor?
Well, so the first, it's a great question. So, I think I'm a part of the first generation of historians where we are living through the greatest breakthrough in how we look at history since the invention of writing scripts. So the ways in which we can use the sciences and scientific data to reshape and re-understand the past, it is so profound because of the new kinds of data sources we have available. The challenge looking at big patterns is that our data is incomplete. So we tend to have quite good materials, for example, about North America, because there are well-funded universities and institutions that fund research projects. So we've got a pretty good idea about levels of precipitation, temperatures, et cetera, not just in the modern period, and not even in antiquity, but going deep into the past. But the continents and the places that you mentioned that I write about, such as West Africa or Polynesia or the Americas before Columbus, have much more patchy and sketchy records. So oftentimes you're looking at a jigsaw that has coherent parts of it that will tell you what's going on, but then there's fuzziness around the edge. And it's difficult sometimes to be absolutely precise about these things, but there are a whole system of global weather patterns that are closely connected. The North Atlantic Oscillation, the El Nino-La Nina cycle, which is the dominant climate signal on Earth, the behavior of the sun, the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, the way in which the moon still affects things like tides and tidal patterns in the Earth today. And it stands to reason that over thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, those patterns will change. So we have a pretty good idea about what's happening where, but it's very rarely things all happening at the same way at the same time. So in the modern era right now, when we're talking the 21st century, for the first time we've ever got any records, the whole planet is all warming at the same time. And that has never happened before. That we've got no moment where we can tell that Europe and the northern hemisphere is warming, and so is the southern hemisphere, and whichever longitude you go on to. But in the past, you'll have to be highly selective based on what data you have available. But that availability is totally transformational, eye-opening, and almost blinding, because most historians, we learn how to read texts, we learn about the archaeology and the art and the material culture. But now historians need to understand genomics, plant sciences, biology, chemistry, geochemistry, to be able to use these data sources. And if you don't, you're turning your back on materials that allow you to think about the past in a different way.
Peter Frankopan, Professor Global History, Worcester College, Oxford. The book is The Earth Transformed, The Rise of Cities That Leave Records, Law Records, Codes Records. Relationships then are suggestive. Professor, this is trade. This is globalization. Do I overread it?
No, I think some of my colleagues will get very overexcited about the word globalization, because it clearly means something in the modern world that is different to the past. In the past, connecting the Americas to each other and also to the other great continents of the world is obviously a different story. But one can talk about long-range connections linking Europe, Africa, and Asia going back thousands of years. And I think that if one is willing to be relatively generous with the idea about what globalization means in terms of exchange, we can chart that through the exchange of goods. We can exchange that through the exchange of ideas, which are a little bit more tricky to always pin how they're moving and how they're being spread. But we can also test through linguistics and genetics. And those kinds of things tell us a wholly different picture of what is going on around about 4,000 years ago, of those rise of those cities in competition with each other, often in conjunction with each other. But one of the things that's most interesting is that the glue between these cities and the key driver for these cities is their connection often to nomadic peoples who are the conveyors and the vectors of long distance goods, ideas, technologies, and so on. So ideas about bronze, different kinds of cereals, different kinds of rices are being transported not by city dwellers, but by nomadic or mobile peoples. And of course, mobile peoples don't just travel distances. They have access to protein sources through their livestock, dairy, of course, textiles that from the wool and the leather from sheep and horses, etc. And so this world that rises together, one can talk about, I think, in a globalized system. Obviously, the distances are huge, and the connections are never from one side of the earth to the other. There are a series of dots that are all buzzing together all the time, and sometimes more intensively than others.
Volcanoes often playing a major role in climate adaptation. And let's go to a big one we've all visited if we've been to the Mediterranean, Tira, Santorini now. The volcano that's blamed for the loss of Crete, or what happens to Crete. Does that have a worldwide effect on crops, the explosion?
Yeah, all the big volcanic eruptions inject large amounts of particles into the atmosphere, and a lot depends on the latitude of the volcano. A lot depends on the timing of the eruption, and a lot depends on the explosivity. In fact, in the case of Thera, although the drama of the destruction of Crete, which is a kind of major focal point of inter-Mediterranean trade, and in fact trade across the Middle East and North Africa too, one of the things that it does that's probably has a longer run impact is that it triggers a change in the variola virus, which is the virus that sits behind smallpox. And smallpox, probably over the course of the last 3,500 years, I mean, it killed something like 300 million people. So that, to me, is more measurable and more dramatic than a single point of failure because of the eruptions. But when these volcanoes do go big, they do the kinds of things that we understand because of the last 12, 15 months, which is that there's sudden inflationary pressures. Their governments find it hard to collect revenues. They borrow more. They become more fragile. They tend to become much more disruptive because of political opportunists. And a good example of that comes with another volcanic eruption a little bit after Thera, in Okmok in Alaska. That erupts in 43 BC. And those of you who remember your classical educations will remember that Julius Caesar is murdered in 44 BC. And to hunt down the assassins, because vengeance is required in Rome, because a state, if someone important gets taken out, it's not okay to allow the assassins to roam around. The hunt goes to bring Brutus and Cassius and the others to justice. Okmok erupts about 12 months later and has a dramatic impact on global crops as far as we can tell, but in particular, it affects the Nile flood. And why that becomes important is that the Nile flood has these rich waters that come out every year that produce crops across the Nile Valley that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. And that produced, exactly like I mentioned, inflation, crop shortages, disease, famine, inequalities widen when there are shocks and pressures. So the poor are always the ones who suffer most with any kind of shock event, whether it's war or climatic. And that creates real turbulence in Egypt. And that turbulence is directed above all at Queen Cleopatra, who is the descendant of a Greek general. Her family are all Greek speakers. She's multilingual, but they are seen when it suits the Egyptian elites as outsiders. And those Egyptian outsiders decide this is a moment to rock the boat and push Cleopatra out of power. So she does the very sensible thing, which is she makes an alliance with the most powerful and most popular of the Romans at the time, Mark Antony.
30 seconds, Professor. Go ahead.
Yeah, with Mark Antony. And it turns out that they're up against a devious little conniver called Octavian, who is the great hero, in fact, of people like Mark Zuckerberg, who becomes renamed Augustus because Octavian manages to snooker or take out Mark Antony Cleopatra and take Egypt as the great prize that turns Rome from a republic into an empire, literally. And that's not because of volcano, but the volcanic eruptions, the agricultural pressures, the ecological pressure it produced had massive political consequences.
The book is The Earth Transformed. Peter Frankopan is the author. We're now in the Roman warm period, which is a delight because I've done so much of my reading, most recently about all of the Game of Thrones played around Rome and throughout the Mediterranean world, and now to discover it again as reacting to and dealing with and getting lucky about climate is a joy. Peter, you've already mentioned Cleopatra, who steals the scenes, but the Romans have an important philosophical approach to ecology, to nature. They want to live in harmony with it. At the same time, they want to take advantage of it to spread their empire. The Romans, from what you present, Peter, look to be lucky. Is that too much to take away from their achievements? They were at the right place at the right time, in the right part of the world, with the Mediterranean as their road to build the empire, and yet at the same time, the climate was not disruptive. At least it wasn't disorderly as it could have been in other periods.
I think you could widen that, John. If we had a long time with a glass of wine, I'd maybe say that all empires need to be lucky. All empires need to get institutions right. They need to get justice systems right, and they need to get forms of equality right to be stable, because otherwise they topple over. So Rome did lots of things that were to do with skill of good administration and good institutions. But all empires are extractive. Their aim is to widen the peripheries and to not just go and colonize and conquer space for the sake of it, but to conquer space that is ecologically important, either because it is good for fields and crops or trees, or because it has minerals or whatever that might be, stone, or in the modern era, the race for oil, the race for lithium today. So there are always extractive powers that are driving the expansion of empire. But where Rome was lucky was that between the eruption of Okmok in 43, for the next 250 years, almost 300 years, it's a time of real stability environmentally. What that means is that a bit like your household budget, if your paycheck comes in every month and you know what you're going to expect, you can plan for the future. You can take a few risks now and again. What derails you is if suddenly you lose your job and your mortgage payments fall due and you can't make ends meet. And so for the 250 years after Octavius, or then Augustus, becomes emperor and Rome takes on this magnificence, where Augustus, when he dies, he says, I found this city of Rome built in marble and in brick, and I beg your pardon, I found the city built in brick and I left it in marble. Rome's transformation is huge. But for the next 300 years, they don't have big shocks. There's a plague outbreak in the 2nd century, but otherwise it's business as usual. And that allows for you to plan, occasionally take risks, fund your army, and have reliable and understandable levels of economic inflationary controls. That all goes wrong in the 230s. Over the course of the next 30, 40 years. Instead of having one emperor passing on to the next and murders behind the couch every now and again, you find 26 emperors in the course of about 40 years, with about double that number of would-be emperors. And that's not just because Roman society has become more tendentious, more argumentative. It's because there's a series of crises, and crises give opportunities for people to chance their arm. So once the bubble pops, the question is, how do you rebalance? And eventually Rome rebalances by the great emperor Constantine dominating all the other competitors for the throne, and eventually building a new city, which he calls New Rome, on the banks of the Bosphorus, in what's now, which the city became called after him, Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. But I think the moral of the story of Rome is that if you can avoid shocks and you stay lucky, then you can be the master of your own destiny. You can still get plenty of things wrong. You can still cut down all the trees. You can still run out of food. You can still be stabbed in the bath. But if you keep experiencing shock, then it's very, very hard to be able to respond.
Yes, you quote wonderfully Shakespeare. When sorrows come, they come not in single spies, but in battalions. So let's listen to the battalions that come to Rome and that they survive. You've mentioned the 3rd century AD, but there's a subplot which we pass by, but I want to go back to it. The aridity of Central Asia, the grassland spreading from the east to the west, and here comes the horse. And I believe the horse will be part of the magic of the Huns that eventually plunder Rome in the 5th century, early 5th century, creating Constantinople as a power. The horse, in your telling, Peter, the horse is a magical character. Was the horse treated that way when it reached Europe and when it reached North America? Always magical.
Magical. I mean, in fact, where the horse is really magical is in both India and in China. So in the Vedic text, the horse plays a totally sacred role. And in China, individual horses have, they have names that are more famous than the multi-time winner of the Kentucky Derby or the Grand National here. So the horse is held in huge respect because, of course, it allows humans to cover long distances at great speed. Horses play a great role in dragging chariots, so they can increase your military capabilities, as well as your ability to spread information, potentially reliably, not always, but to spread information quickly. So the horse is key. And of course, then the next question is that some of those regions in central China, in India as a whole, in the Middle East, are not very good land to rear horses because you need a lot of water and pasture. And the great expertise of the Central Asian or the nomads living across the Eurasian steppes is to breed very, very large herds of horses and to train them. So these horses are in huge demand, and huge demand across all societies. When they're first introduced into Mesopotamia, the accounts describe sheer terror at being able to handle an animal this magnificent and strong-willed. But once horsepower becomes harnessed by humans, it becomes a source that, one could argue, allows for the conquest of the Americas by Europeans, because the one big difference between the Americas and Europe, Africa, and Asia is the absence of large pack animals in the Americas before the European arrivals. So I think that the horse is hugely important to try to think about. And those Huns you mentioned, John, as a result of changing circumstances on the climate and pressures of food and pasture, it creates a series of interconnected events that force tribes to cooperate with each other, that then become competitive forces. And in the case of the Huns, they spill over into Europe and very easily dismantle the infrastructure of the Roman Empire, probably not through force and violence, but just because once connections break down between cities and the center, it's very hard to rebuild them. Once bureaucrats have left their jobs, no one knows how to do anything. So I guess, again, like in Iraq, after the Ba'ath Party were taken out of power in 2003, if you lose all your bureaucrats in one fell swoop, no one knows how to charge taxes. No one knows where to put the money. No one knows how to make the state work, and things collapse very quickly.
There's another subplot in Peter's telling, which is large cities, large empires are strong because of trade. They have their strengths, they have their ability to specialize, but they're brittle as well when there's a major change in climate, especially drought. I noted again and again, Peter, city-states that are set up, built with elaborate aqueducts or ability to gain water to irrigate their crops. When a drought of not very substance, 3 or 4 years is the drought that we experience often in the US, the governance cannot hold the empire together.
I mean, it's terrifying, but I mean, I think that's right. I mean, for example, the city of Dubai at the moment in the Middle East carries 24 hours water reserves. That's it. So you can see how a single event or catastrophic failure of water systems for whatever reason suddenly makes a city unviable overnight. In the 20th century, Russia or the Soviet Union twice collapsed in a matter of days. This huge empires can suddenly fold very, very quickly. And I think that's something that's quite salutary to realize that it's a bit like sort of a house of cards that can be very tall, but you take one out, the whole thing comes tumbling down. So I think in the ancient world, we see time and again patchworks of cities that cross-rely, they compete with each other, they all look impregnable, and yet they fail because trade networks go down, and then the things that follow often come to food shortages, inflation and violence, war and escalation, but also lower calorie consumption, and that affects immune systems. That means you're more immunocompromised to pathogens, and then when diseases catch hold, you're into a doom spiral, and suddenly cities that were once great disappear. And the greatest cities of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, if we'd been alive then, John, and were able to do this by Zoom, we'd have been talking in and about Uruk, or Nineveh, or Nippur, or Angkor 1,000 years ago, or Isfahan or Bukhara, cities that people may have heard of, but few can put a place on the map, whereas most people know where New York City is, or London, and so on. So I think that those compressions of how collapses can happen when a single plank is pulled out are quite interesting in the past to see those fragilities.
And again, I want to emphasize here, my reading of your presentation, Peter, is that climate doesn't drive change. It is part of change. It augments change. It is something to respond to. And your resilience is the measure of how you hold yourself together for the next epoch. Do I say all that correctly? You want to adjust?
No, I think that's right. And I mean, we remember that from biblical texts and the Abrahamic faiths, that the world was created as a perfect paradise by God, and at the last minute, the humans were put there with the simple instruction, don't eat from the forbidden tree, and otherwise you'll have everything you need, the right amount of rain, neither too much nor too little, a Goldilocks zone. And what happened by disobeying God is that the punishment was through ecological means. So the being expelled from the Garden of Eden meant that Adam and Eve had to scrabble around in the dirt to try to make crops grow. They had to be grateful for when rains came, and they were no longer. They had to try to control an environment that was hostile. And in fact, repeatedly after that, the flood of Noah, or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, done by a vengeful God who was angered by the way in which humans lived unsustainably and unkindly. So those stories about how we should learn about the past and be sensitive to the pressures. I think that is exactly right. That the ability to try to harness the environment and to use it sustainably is something that has such a long pedigree and a long history that it's not just something to do with us here in the 21st century.
The book is The Earth Transformed, An Untold History. Peter Frankopan is the author. And we now go to a period that is striking in that Scandinavians now take a role, as does climate, because of the cooling of some temperatures before the medieval warm period, and then suddenly the warming that was created in the dates, especially between 950 and 1250. And again, Peter, I circled in my notes, low volcanism, correct? That is the explanation for why this period is so stable.
That's a prime reason. But the natural cycles are also important in that, but also the ability to be successful. So those changes provide motivations and incentives and rewards to look out for new pastures, either because, for example, changes of wind direction or intensity, or because of resource shortage. There are pressures and pulls and pushes to look at new worlds. And in fact, those expansions of the Vikings out into the North Atlantic towards first Iceland, then Greenland, and then Newfoundland are mirrored at about the same time, the same process, by peoples in the southern oceans of the South Pacific, where there's a whole series of colonizations of new areas and new islands that have never seen humans before. And again, we can date some of this because of new scientific data and technologies. But in the case of the North Atlantic, some of the drive was was to do with movements of shoals of fish further northwards into cooler waters as a result of the warming patterns. Some to do with the fact that these new lands that were discovered offered new abilities, new goods to trade. For example, walrus in large quantities that was very important. The walrus hides for making high quality ropes, or walrus tusks that were rival to elephant for ivory that was used in both religious and secular art. And so suddenly hitting a gold mine, so to speak, prompted higher levels of colonization. The challenge, of course, that the Vikings then ran into, or the Norse people ran into, is that most of the colonizers were men, because men want to take the rewards and think that they're brave. And so then you need to be able to find women and to be able to reproduce with. So that's solved in a couple of ways. One is by sort of tourist propaganda being spread around places like Norway, saying, come to Iceland, it's beautiful in the summer, there's plenty of land, you can be a queen in your own place here. But also through enslavement, coercion, and sexual violence and rape, by forcibly moving women, particularly from Ireland and northern Scotland, to settle in these islands too. And colonization of new territories is not a romantic, idyllic exploration of virgin territories. It's always combined with violence against other human beings in one form or another, but also with the acquisition of new natural resources. And typically what happens is that there's a rush towards them, like the Californian gold rush, and then too many people chase the same things, and then those supplies become cheaper, and then they get exhausted. And in the case of North America, the reason why Newfoundland fails as a colony is because it's too expensive to maintain and doesn't bring the rewards because prices have fallen.
We go to North America, however, a city I did not know existed, Cahokia, around 900 AD. You say this is a measure of the Big Bang of population. What was Cahokia? How did it thrive?
Well, Cahokia. We have no written record, so it's all based on the archaeological evidence, and it's to do with looking at the size of mounds that are set up in the southern part of the United States, that obviously allowing larger populations to cooperate together. And when there is cooperation, the first thing you try to look for is what levels of elite housing is there, what kind of defenses are required, and are those monuments and buildings and defenses designed to express power and project how important the rulers are, or are they about defending yourself against other competitor sets? And Cahokia is probably the most important of all of the settlements in North America before the arrival of Columbus, because a state is able to hold together reasonably successfully for the best part of 200 or 300 years, until again, exhaustion of resources, possibly to do with bacterial infections, possibly to do with social unrest, possibly to do with too many elites competing with each other and draining away resources, then means that what had been a cooperative cosmopolitan city starts to sag. And empires very rarely go out with an explosion or with a bang. They tend to just suffocate themselves and collapse under their own weight. And that seems to be what happens with Cahokia round about the late 1200s.
The subcontinent, the Chola people, they were a sizable empire in contest with others in the area. They were sustained and then they weakened. Did they weaken because of climate change, or they were not able to adapt? Why did they fail?
Well, this time of low volcanism and climatic stability between around 950 and 1250 sees the rise of what Victor Lieberman calls parallel empires. So you see across from the Mediterranean going eastwards, a great Middle Eastern Islamic state based on the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, You see a great empire in Pagan, what's now Burma. You see the Chola in southern India. You see the Khmer and the great city of Angkor. You see the Shijavai, which is a great archipelago nation of what's now roughly Indonesia or so on. And these states are all rising together. And then, of course, the Tang and then the Song dynasty in China. All of these are massive states, and they all rise together at the same time because they're fueling each other's rise. Again, I suppose how the United States and China fueled each other's rise in the last 30 years until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and then things look slightly different. But those parallel roles of competition, trade, enhanced access allow for these great states to rise together. And because they're watching each other and having diplomatic exchanges, they see how each other's rituals work. They see how their palaces, how their temples look. So there's a lot of investment into the kinds of monuments that are so attractive to go and look at today, if you can, to visit places like Angkor.
30 seconds.
But the Chola are hugely successful in exporting Indian ideas and Indian culture, particularly eastwards into Southeast Asia, and the expansion of Hinduism alongside Sanskrit and Indian culture.
So the medieval warm period has parallel empires, and we're now about to proceed to the exploitation of nature and humankind in the Atlantic, especially. Professor Peter Frankopan, the book is The Earth Transformed: An Untold History. The mosquito empires of the period that we reached to in North America, as well as Africa, as well as Asia, the mosquito empires, the limits of malaria, aka yellow fever. I learned from the professor that in this period of exploitation of nature and mankind, in the 17th and 18th century, the limits of the people to survive in mosquito empires defined their ability to respond to the politics in Europe and also the opportunities in the New World. Professor, the malaria story is one that I did not ever think of as a limitation on the Europeans. Did they themselves see it that way?
Yes, they did. And in common parlance, West Africa was known as the white man's grave. So short were life expectancies when many Europeans tried to reach West Africa. And one of the challenges was around disease environments. Ironically, what happened in the case of transatlantic slavery was that many of the peoples who were being transported, of course, against their will in horrific conditions, bonded forever, and their progeny too, were so desirable, particularly after the 1670s, 1680s, was because not all, but some populations in West Africa contain genetic mutations that give genetic resistance to malaria, or at least provide 90% resistance to malaria. And that mutation meant that their survivability in malarial areas, which has been passed down from generation to generation for several thousand years, made them extremely resilient in exposed malarial zones, both in West Africa, but also in the Americas once malaria became established in the late 17th century. And we can see the horrors of this because the prices of peoples who came from zones with high malarial resistance are higher than from others. So there was no idea, I think, about the science at the time amongst those buying and selling people's lives, but there was an understanding that for some reason, some types of people from some areas were more hardy and more able to cope with disease. And of course, I suppose, if you want to put it very crudely, they're racially superior in their ability to cope with infections that killed everybody else. So when we see mortality rates, for example, in North Carolina, when malaria becomes established, the numbers of those who don't, of white Europeans who don't reach their 5th birthday or don't reach 18, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the brutality of those who die. So transatlantic slavery is partly driven by that, but it's also driven by the fact that new crops that are brought back in the other direction across the Atlantic, like cassava, manioc, potatoes, allow for high levels of calorie provision in domestic populations that mean that there is labor forces that can be, in the first instance, can be sold because they're no longer required in the same quantities. So there's a kind of constant reinsertion of the natural world, mosquito empires, crops, labor, soils, rainfall, to be able to work out how we think about this period. And the things I didn't know before I wrote the book were around, the calculations about what was the best time of year to set sail from Africa with a shipload full. And it was always after the harvest had been collected in West Africa, also to make sure that their arrival points in the so-called New World would coincide with the ability to be able to feed those who'd survived across the journey. So the horrors, I think, of seeing a ecological and environmental and climatological context to the slave trade seems to me extremely important to understand it properly.
I'm struck by the assertion of the British, of the English sailors to dominate the slave trade. This is King Charles II Royal African Campaign. 50% in 1680 Africa trade, 90% of the Africa trade in the 1780s. So in that period between 1650 and 1750, the prosperity of Great Britain, well, England at the time, and then the uniting with Scotland, the prosperity was built on the African trade. Is that too general? Is that too much of a generality?
Yeah, I think one would qualify carefully. I mean, I think there's a whole cycle of which all needs to be integrated together. I mean, in the first instance, some of those advances that were made in Britain at that time were because of education and universities, and that requires donors that make their money from somewhere. Many of those are making them very indirectly from the slave trade, but because they're industrialists that are building cities and real estate and etc., then they're making their fortunes in other ways. But fundamentally, the resource benefits that come back towards Europe from the silver, in the first instance, the silver of the Americas towards Spain in particular, but then towards the rest of Europe, then of the crops such as tobacco and cotton and sugar, all help fuel and come for the benefit of the people who are able to control that trade, the capitalist interests. So in that sense, one I think has to not put a simple answer on it, but there's no question that the foundation of European strength comes from the way in which the Americas are exploited, and to some extent also Africa, which is exploited for its labor, but also for minerals and resources too, and of course Asia, where the high intensity of spice trades, silk trades, and this is all happening at a time where the East India Company is getting its hooks into Indian politics and Indian cash funds, means that one has to, I think, take this all as a whole. So, for example, with the Battle of Plassey in the end of the 1750s, Robert Clive is able to take control of the entire purse of Bengal, which he promptly takes back home and makes him possibly the richest man in the world, but certainly a billionaire many times over in today's terms. And one would link that, I think, to the ideas about racial superiority, around weapons training, around the ideas that Europeans should and could run the world better than anybody else. And I think that all feeds into a story that allows Europe to become the richest part of the world for several hundred years. But they're very new to the party. I mean, as I've written about in my book on the Silk Roads, Europe's rise has been extremely recent in the scheme of human history. No one would have bet on a little rock in the North Atlantic colonizing a quarter of the world. And the ability to do that, it requires some explanation. And I think the ecologies and the natural history plays an understated part in that in the way most people tell it.
Daniel Defoe, I only have a piece of the quote that you use, no Africa trade, no continent. Was that an understanding in London at the time, or is he mocking the king?
No, it's an understatement. I mean, he says, and if the continent goes, if transatlantic slavery goes, then Britain has no empire, no economy, and nothing to rest its hat on. And so I think there's a real awareness around the race against time to build a resilient imperial structure that makes sure it's protected. And that comes through investment in shipping, that comes through investment in new technologies, that comes through investment in knowledge. One of the things that the Royal Navy did so well was to train sailors to cope in difficult wind conditions that then helps build towards the First and the Second World Wars and the resilience that pays off many centuries later. So the creation of institutions is how Defoe wanted to protect these, and it's how the wealthy did it. And in Britain, we did it very well by making sure that the king wasn't allowed to make decisions. He wasn't allowed to send people to war without votes of parliament. And then on our cousins on the other side of the Atlantic and the colonies eventually took the view that the king shouldn't, even parliament shouldn't be allowed to make those kinds of decisions when it came to the colonies, unless the colonies themselves had a vote. Although, again, as I write about in my book, it's more complicated than that because, in fact, some of the pressures and the desire of people living in the colonies in North America to create their own destiny, be master of their own destiny, was to do with their desire to be able to trade with hurricane-stricken places in the Caribbean and the southern part of the United States, where Americans like John Adams and Samuel Adams, eventually George Washington, felt that it was wrong to be stopped from trading with the French or the Spanish just because they were the enemies of England, where the Spanish and the French in distressed conditions would pay almost anything for goods coming from places like Philadelphia. And the idea that the Americans would be stopped from trading was one of the drivers towards the push towards independence.
Is it too early, this period, 1650 to 1750, to speak of deforestation, or is that already underway?
No, there's well, in the Americas, there's reforestation as it happens. The decline of the indigenous populations is so profound that we see levels of forest recovery that are quite substantial, so much so that some scholars have tried to think about whether there's a way in which we should think about the oxygen and carbon dioxide atmospheric changes in the 1600s to do with population death and reforestation. But in other parts of the world, there's heavy deforestation taking place at this time because of population rises and the rises of new empires and new cities. So it's always part of the holistic looking at the whole.
The book is The Earth Transformed, an Untold History. Professor Peter Frankopan is the author, looking at climate, ecology, pandemic, volcanoes, all of that, and how humankind, especially the civilizations that reach back the last 5,000 years, have responded. Some have, some have not. Now we come to a debate that is ongoing about whether or not there is a way of explaining why Europe seems to accelerate in terms of science and technology over Asia, where much of the innovation of the earlier 1,000 or 2,000 years took place. I know that having visited Central Asia, the city-states of Tashkent, of Kabul, of Samarkand, all of those city-states were well established with science and learning and education. Thousands of years before that came to Europe. I date European universities, remembering 1222 Padua. That is the period of time when universities and guilds are mixing with what is known as the feudal revolution. And the professor teaches me that that is too shorthand. There's a lot of complication that went on in the 13th century in Europe. But in any event, Europe is said to accelerate. Professor, the Great Divergence, is there an explanation, or are we too close to it? Do we need another 1,000 years to figure this out?
Well, it's a great question. There are so many fantastic scholars who work on this question, most notably Ken Pomerantz at University of Chicago. And the question really is, how was it that Europe, as you say, a relative backwater, lots of pearls and individual moments of highlights before sort of 1500, but how was it that Europe managed to take over the world? And in the case of Africa, for example, every single part of Africa was colonized by European power, apart from Ethiopia and Liberia by the start of the First World War. How was it that so many European states had empires? Belgium had an empire, the Netherlands, Denmark had territories in the Caribbean. How did that happen? And above all, how did they take over great empires like India, the Mughal Empire, and China? And there are lots of different ways in which one can try to answer that question. One, I suppose, if you're being very provocative, possibly it's that states like India and China, but let's say China, were too well run. Their bureaucrats had extensive competitions to appoint the best of the best of the best of the best, impossibly high standards. But everybody then thought the same way, behaved the same way. There are all sorts of ways in which one can try to argue and explain why, but from my point of view, the one that perhaps is most interesting is around location of coal fields after the Industrial Revolution prioritizes the ability of new technologies to change labor relationships. And in the case of England in particular, Great Britain, our coal fields are very well located in their proximity to the capital and quite easy to ship coal from places like Newcastle by sea down to London. Not particularly expensive, not particularly far. China's coal fields are located a long way from the eastern coast, which is where the majority of China's population still lives to this day. And so it meant that you have the resources, even if you want to be able to exploit them, you don't have manpower in the right place. It's expensive. Coal is bulky. It's heavy. You don't have waterways that can ship to where you need it. And so the lack of ability to respond is one thing. But obviously one looks at cultural ways in which universities or disruptors or new technologies are able to break through, and sometimes how well-run governments can suppress good ideas. And what looks like the case in China is that the bureaucracy stifles new ideas because they're unfamiliar with them. In the case of India, it's a series of different questions of different Mughal emperors. But in both these cases, climate again often pops up with large-scale water shortages and famines that can on occasion in India run to death tolls in the tens of millions in the worst cases. In Bengal famine in the 1770s, probably something like 30 million people dying. And those kinds of things shatter the state because that reduces taxable revenues, it destroys families, cities can crumble, agricultural land goes to waste, it doesn't get looked after properly, and sometimes becomes overexploited, or I mean underexploited rather, and then requires a huge kickstart to get going again. And those kinds of shocks provide a sort of a punch to the solar plexus that you bend over double. And if you've got somebody hovering, wanting to offer you an easy way out, that's often how things go wrong. That's more or less how the Dutch took over most of what became the Dutch East Indies and what's now Indonesia. That's mainly how the British took over most of India. That's mainly how the French took over places like Vietnam and large parts of Southeast Asia, as well as Africa. But there's a whole set of circumstances that's required. And we historians will argue the toss with each other about which one we might want to rank first. But certainly, I think we would agree that there's a clutch of these that we need to take seriously.
Another volcano always entering the case, just as you thought you'd solved it. Loki. I have 1783. I hope that's right. It turns out the temperature plunged for the next several years. And that just so happens to be coincidentally when the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the Revolutionary War. But I'm not going to connect those points. I'm just going to say it's a coincidence. However, I see that the climate shock hit Egypt, it hit Japan, and then recovery from that was the wettest year ever. So that there were a series of shocks to what became part of the British Empire. The sun never sets. Did that make the ability of Britain to project power easier because of the disorder in the atmosphere? We have about a minute.
Well, then let me steer away from the British and go for the Ottomans, because that's the most interesting one. In fact, the Ottomans controlled Egypt at that time, and because of the failure of the Nile flood and the compressions that we've mentioned already before, it meant that the Ottomans wanted to try to stamp their control back over the rebel elites in Egypt, who were so powerful and so rich they operated their own militias. At that moment, when a big army was sent from Istanbul to restore order, that was the moment where Catherine the Great decided in her wisdom to annex Crimea to make it part of the great Russian Empire.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, we now have the global geopolitical situation we have today. Because the Ottomans were facing south, trying to deal with Egypt, their best man on the job, with his army resources in the wrong place, by the time he got up to the Black Sea, the dice had been cast. And so these things, one has to take the nuance and not blame individual factors, but maybe Catherine the Great would have invaded Crimea anyway. Maybe she had done it equally successfully. Maybe it wouldn't have made any difference. But certainly the way in which the cards play out as a result of these kinds of shocks and compressions makes us, I think, reintegrate the natural world and shock events, climate ones, into periods of history we thought we knew quite well.
Peter Frankopan, The Earth Transformed. We turn to the age of turbulence, late 19th century. We come to 1870 to 1920. Modern enough for us to recognize the products, but at the same time, rubber, following cotton, rubber trees. The other products of cocoa and tobacco have been commonplace for several hundred years. However, we now look for nitrates for fertilizer. These are all English novels, and so I was jotting down. The professor provided Lord Jim for the nitrates of guano, Lord Jim by Conrad. But he also mentions whale oil, and I jotted in Herman Melville. And Professor, I mentioned to you that in anticipation of my conversation with you about your book, I went to the sign of 4 the second of the Sherlock Holmes stories about a theft of diamonds and rubies from a Maharaja in India. This is following the so-called mutiny of the mid-19th century. And it is surprising to read Conan Doyle's interpretation of the world from the Thames point of view, from Sherlock Holmes's point of view, considering what you explicate in your presentation as how the British Empire exploited and and disdained, and what at this point you'd have to say damaged the cultures of so many peoples. And it was all in keeping with the power of the empire in 1870. This was also true in the United States. It's also true in many European countries. Is there a new appreciation for this now, Professor? Has something happened? Because I don't remember this in my 20th century education.
It's a lovely question, John. I'm enjoying myself so much. I can feel, as we're heading towards the late 19th century, the tristesse of the conversations that are coming towards the twilight. So I'd love to drag this out for hours, but I suspect your listeners probably have other things they want to be doing. Look, I think that all empires, as I've said, are all extractive, trying to get their hands on resources. And one could make the case that in today's world, where empires in all but name, big corporations, the United States, China, and so on, the need to protect national security, to have resource resilience, drives all sorts of decisions that lead to degradation of landscapes, and of course to human experiences too, because the prioritization of any empire is that your people have to come first. So I think that in the 19th century, the thing that changes so dramatically are the sudden arrivals of new technologies, things like the telegraph that goes from covering a few thousand miles in North America in the early 1800s to covering millions of miles by the end of the 19th century. And the ability to move goods cheaper, quicker than ever before, the location of coal fields in the Midwest of the US, the opening up of California, partly to do with the gold rush of 1849, mirrors what you see going on in other parts of the world where administrators and business entrepreneurs, as they're called today, but capitalists or whatever you want to call them, are all looking for things that can be monetized and have value. And the value that they have is never local, it's the value back at home. And if you can't find things where you're looking, you transplant and you bring new things. So rubber, for example, native to the Amazon and to South America, is transplanted into what's now Malaysia, or the Malay Peninsula as it was. So round about the end of the 1900s, there's about 145 acres of land growing rubber in the Malay Peninsula. 50 years later, there are 500,000 acres. And to create space for those, those new landscapes, that means chopping down what's already there. And chopping down what's already there changes ecosystems. It changes ecosystems for animal life, for insects, for plants. And it produces long-term change that cascades, because you don't just change that area, all the areas that were connected to it on either side start to shift too. And the globalizing technologies of shipping, of being able to put things in tin cans, they'll be able to refrigerate and move goods and move meat from one side of the world to the other, so it's still edible. It's so profound that it's cheaper to ship from grain from the United States to London than it is to ship grain from Ireland to London, from Dublin to London, which is a fraction of the distance. So these new technologies are bringing all those parts of the world together. So the novelists you mentioned, whether it's Melville or Joseph Conrad, are picking up on the fact that there are fortunes to be made, that there is a race against nature, that you can defeat these great giant animals, or you can take advantage of nitrates to make yourself obscenely rich. And it's to do with who can get their hands on things that are valuable fastest.
You make the important revelation to me that the migration that I presumed was from Eastern Europe to the US, or from Ireland to the US after the potato famine, was matched or overwhelmed by migration in the Indo-Pacific, India to Southeast Asia, and China to East Africa, everywhere. In other words, all those peoples were moving as well, with profound changes that we see today in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific.
I think it's just a function of how Eurocentric our view of the world has always been, that we've tended always to look at Europe and its inheritor states, like the United States, and for very good reason, because for the last 200 or 300 years, that's been the part of the map to look at and the culture and so on to focus on. But I think we've done that at our peril by exceptionalizing, by making ourselves think that what we've done has been different. But as you rightly say, in fact, the number of people moving in the Indo-Pacific region is greater than transatlantic trade. And as you would absolutely rightly say, today now, ideas around identities and heritages and genetics and who gets to decide who's ethnically what are extremely sensitive, as one would expect in many countries in the Indo-Pacific, partly because it's a very live issue now around people buying property from, let's say, mainland China or China's current geopolitical ambitions. So I think that the always reminding that the world is bigger than we think, and that these regions that get kicked into the footnotes of history or sometimes omitted altogether need to always be there. So I've tried to work in the book to make sure that we're always checking in on the different parts of the world to make sure that we're all coming along together.
The positives, at least the attempts to be positives. Let's stay with India, the jewel of the crown. The famine, drought cycle, from flood to aridity, that was seen as something to defeat. And so the British, the empire, contributed railroads, contributed the telegraph, contributed central organization, especially in the Western Punjab. Was it successful, Professor?
Well, all of those investments were primarily around making the movement of goods and people cheaper and more efficient. So they weren't done to, as acts of charity. They had a specific role in the administration of the Indian subcontinent and in being able to make it more efficient and its goods more available at lower prices. So in that sense, undoubtedly, the things that were more complicated and went more badly wrong were building of dams across rivers in ways that were thought to be able to show the mastery of man over nature, that then cut off water supplies for people downstream, or the creation of colonies or the called worker colonies in the Punjab, the border, what's now split between India and Pakistan, where millions of people were encouraged to settle in land that was going to be newly irrigated. That proved very unsuccessful because when you have new canals that deliver water to fields in very high temperatures, the water evaporates quickly and can make the soil saline. And when you have high levels of evaporation and salinity, those soils can be killed for forever. And so the yields were very high in the Punjab, in particular, the breadbasket of the Indian subcontinent. But over the course of 4 or 5 decades, they started to fall back and then became extremely negative. Now, if we look at these parts of the world, the water stress is enormous. I mean, so I've just come back from Pakistan yesterday, and one of the challenges is around water availability in the coming decades, because the water that runs out from the glaciers on the Himalayas is receding, and that's going to create shocks. And the main problem is if you have high population densities in areas that are environmentally vulnerable, then it doesn't take much to tip those into difficulty and danger. But disasters are always man-made. There's always enough food that can reach people, but it's badly deployed and doesn't get to the right place at the right time. But if you anticipate where those challenges might be, then one might prepare for them in a slightly different way.
Volcanoes, always my favorite. They step on the scene and steal my attention. Krakatoa, 1883. First of all, I didn't know Arthur Schuster had identified a good vintage year with the 11-year sun cycle. That is, we'll park that over here as a revelation. Krakatoa, did that lead to the thinking that becomes the greenhouse effect or the climate change language that we use today? Did that trigger that global thinking?
That was already well in place. I mean, Krakatoa, because the world was connected and newspapers were running, and it's a dramatic event, and it clearly was hugely damaging in Indonesia. Death toll in the hundreds of thousands. The sound of the earthquake erupting was heard on ships thousands of kilometers away, and it captured people's imagination. But it wasn't as dramatic and as violent as an eruption as at Tambora in 1815, which had a more important effect on atmospheric patterns and on climate patterns. But people had already by then long started to worry about changes to human experiences and to the climate. Thomas Jefferson, for example, kept a record twice a day for 50 years detailing temperatures and atmospheric pressure, partly because the concern in North America in particular was around deforestation leading to changes in rainfall patterns. But by the early 1800s, scientists and scholars were already writing about how the burning of carbon and fossil fuels would create impacts and changes. So Eunice Foote, for example, in the 1850s published a very important paper that demonstrated that if you burn carbon sources, you're going to end up heating the Earth's atmosphere. By the late 19th century, people like Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist and physicist, was talking in terms of warming temperatures, of climate change, of global warming. We now know that global sea levels started to rise in 1863. We're part of a cycle where the world is warming anyway, naturally, but we are aggravating that and accelerating that warming process very quickly. But if one was to think, when did people start to warn about global warming? We're really going back 200 years. We're really going back to the 1830s, where the first scientific measurements, the first scientific experiments that are showing what is likely to happen given the uses of industrialization and of carbon sources in particular. So it's nothing to be surprised about that we find ourselves in a quite a tight spot today.
I mentioned immediately that Peter has read this book for the audio of it, which I highly recommend. I took notes while listening to Peter read to me, sometimes at double the speed to go faster through parts of it. But then I came across one little, it's almost a subordinate clause, but I went, what? 1889, influenza at Bukhara, a city you've already mentioned, Professor. The suggestion, as yet unexplored to my knowledge, that was a coronavirus outbreak. Do we have any more on that, Peter?
Well, not surprisingly, the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot of excitement around trying to work out what coronaviruses are, how they sprung up in the past. There's been some discussion, some investigation into whether the Spanish flu, in fact, was a coronavirus. And because coronaviruses sound new to people who don't work in infectious diseases, they'll probably be surprised to know that a new coronavirus establishes itself on average every 24 hours. The key thing that a disease needs is it needs vectors. It needs people or animals or ways of spreading. The coronavirus hypothesis for 1889, I don't think there's anything more. The article that's based on was published, I think, 3 years ago, if my memory serves me right, and I think will now be explored further, partly because these amazing advances in the sciences where we can unravel the genomic data behind pathogens. We can look back, for example, at the Black Death, which we didn't talk about. We can look at the phylogenetic tree of that. We can look at the DNA family, and we can see, for example, with the Black Death, the big pathogen behind it, Yersinia pestis, there's a big bang moment about 3 decades before the Black Death devastates most of the world, where this splits into 4 branches. We're not quite sure why that's the case. But so when we look at past diseases, such as the 1889 epidemic, and then the Spanish flu pandemic, the new tools we have to understand what it is that it actually was, because the one thing it certainly wasn't was Spanish, the Spanish flu, but it's trying to use these tools to be able to measure more accurately. But I think the 1889 one, there may be more work that's been done on that in the last 3 years, but I need to brush myself up, and I'll get back to you if you have me on again, John.
Oh, it's a clue. I have to. It's the Sherlock Holmes reader in me. Peter Frankopan, the Earth Transformed. We're coming to the 21st century now, and some notes about how much water do you think it takes to make one cotton shirt? This has to do with natural resources and exploitation. We no longer cut down huge forests. Well, not on purpose. We watch the deforestation of the Amazon and do what we can in governance. But I learned from Peter's reporting that one cotton shirt requires 2,700 liters of fresh water. I'm stunned, Peter. Is that a factor in the cotton industry? I know they've done a lot of work about blood cotton and moving their resourcing out of places where people were badly treated or underpaid, but the use of water seems reckless. Is there a comment on this generally?
Yeah, I mean that amount of water, to just under 3,000 liters of fresh water is the equivalent of a person's drinking needs for 2.5 years. And a pair of jeans, it's about 3 times that amount. The global fashion industry produces around about 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions averaged out, and some projections put it that in the next 20 years that's going to treble. So I think that my job as an educator and as a professor is to give people more knowledge than perhaps they had beforehand, and to let them make their own decisions about how they use that. But I hadn't realized the level of waste, for example, around food. So we waste globally around 930 million tons of perfectly edible food that, if you put that all in 40-ton trucks, would stretch around the world 7 times round, 231 million trucks. So there are all sorts, sorry, 23 million trucks would stretch around the world 7 times round. So the wastage that we go through, because of the way we make things, the way we discard things, the way we throw things away, looks to me totally unsustainable. And of course, we individually, we're quite good, I think. No one really opens the window of their car and chucks trash out onto the sidewalk. No one deliberately throws food away from their fridge because they can't be bothered. You know, but the way in which we don't realize what those cycles of intensive farming, or why do we need the fruit that we eat to look perfect rather than being slightly crooked? There's expectations we have around what perfection means that here in the UK, a report that came out last week shows that farms in the UK destroy the equivalent of 18 million meals every day. And we have in the UK, just like you have in the US, about 20% of our population who are under the age of 18 living in conditions that are benchmarked by the United Nations as poverty. So our ability to be more efficient, to not waste stuff, to be able to understand how the things that we make, how they're made. You know, there are 20,000 plastic bottles are sold per second with sodas in them. That perhaps there are ways in which we can modify very slightly the way we live, that would be economically fruitful as well as being more beneficial. But to be able to do that, you need to have a good education that explains to you where stuff comes from and what its consequences are.
If your book was a novel, I would say this is the point where we learn that our advanced trade in civilization is brittle, and we're about to watch a breakdown. But it's not a novel, it's an observation. So in our final 30 seconds, do you hear the message that you provided and explicated being echoed and heard on media these days? You started as a child watching concern about acid rain. Do you hear it today, Peter? 30 seconds.
Yes, and I'm pragmatic and I'm optimistic. I mean, I do lots of work at the moment with climate scientists and innovation and technologies around things that will make our world much better than we think. But I suppose one of the morals of the book, and as my role as job as a historian, is to say that it's the first thing you said, John, when you introduced me, is you've got to be lucky. And the problem about being lucky is you've got to be lucky all the time. And if you're unlucky, then you're in the wrong place in the wrong time, and things can go very badly wrong. And unfortunately, those dividends are not shared equally. And it always hits the people who are most vulnerable and least able to cope first and hardest. And from that flow a series of consequences that will be different in every different corner of the world, in every different state. So it's about trying to work out what those might be and how to prepare for them, and also how to build up that we maximize the opportunities so we do the best we possibly can.
Peter Frankopan, The Earth Transformed, An Untold Story. Highly recommended. I'm John
Such a
Batchelor.
pleasure. Such a pleasure. Thank you, John, for talking to me.